Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is the final speaker in the Evolutionary Studies seminar series for 2013. I think this may be the first time that we will have an alumnus among the ranks of our speakers. So I am very pleased to be introducing Dan Glass to speak today. Couple housekeeping notes. First off, we will have our final reception of the year in CSB 110 right across the way immediately after. There is unbelievable pizza and cake and juice, and an opportunity to speak with Dan about his work. If you are here for the subject pool for psychology, I'm just going to point out Rebecca, who's raising her hand right there. So if you missed her with the paperwork, you could hit her up at the end, and she will gladly help you out. I have been extremely fortunate to work with what I consider the best of the students here at SUNY New Paltz. The Evolutionary Psych Lab and the students in the Evolutionary Studies program are just an extraordinary testament to the kind of hardworking and intellectually curious students that we have here at SUNY New Paltz. And Dan Glass, who's been a student of mine since 2010, has, I think, just been an outstanding example of the kind of student that we really try to facilitate and support here. Dan came and joined our master's degree program in psychology in 2010. He pretty quickly became one of the assistants. He was the assistant for the Evolutionary Studies program while he was a graduate student. And the thing about Dan is he quickly and enthusiastically took on projects when he saw opportunities. So he's had, as I think that you'll see in his talk, he's had extraordinary success for someone at his particular career stage. I do think he's an outstanding guy, but I think his success is beyond because of that. I think that he is someone who has said, when there's an opportunity, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to take this on, and I'm going to take initiative and really welcome opportunities. And with that attitude, he has had an awful lot of success that's really made for a lot of great things. So he won the Outstanding Student Award in Psychology in 2012 for the master's program. He has had, depending on how you count, upwards of 8 publications in his 2 years as a master's degree student at New Paltz. This is typically enough for someone to get tenure at a standard state university. So it's an extraordinary amount, which is really a testament to the kind of work that he's done. Since he's done good work, he's been asked to do a lot of things. So he has been asked to join the Applied Evolutionary Psychology Society. He is now the secretary for that society. He is a member of NEEPS, the Northeastern Evolutionary Psych Society. He was recently elected unanimously as the membership officer for that society. At the last NEEPS conference, along with a presentation that was given by Mandy Guitar, he was co-author of the best student presentation at the entire conference for their research on the evolution of emotions, and the presentation was fantastic. When he gave his master's thesis defense, and he'll be talking about some of the research related to it today, he gave his master's thesis defense last May, and when he stepped out of the room, I don't know if I've ever told him this, one of the people in the room said that was given as if not it was someone with a PhD, but it was like someone who is a leader in the field, and this is exactly the kind of work that we have come to see out of Dan. He is editorial associate for the Journal of Social, Evolutionary, and Cultural Psychology. He did such a great job in that same capacity for EvoS Journal as the editorial associate that for this year, in an interim capacity along with myself and Rose Chang, he is serving as co-editor for EvoS Journal. He's done lots of great work, and he keeps at it. He is teaching currently. He's been asked to teach courses related to evolution and behavior at UMass Boston, and the other, what's the other school? And the New England Institute of the Arts. Doesn't that sound cool? And he has recently been accepted to a PhD program in clinical psychology at Suffolk University. Please join me in welcoming Dan Glass.
Thank you, Glenn. That was really sweet. Glenn has been a better mentor than he described me as a student. So extremely fortunate to have been able to work with Glenn, and I credit him for all the things that I've done here. So here's my clicker. What I want to talk to you about today is evolutionary approaches to the field of clinical psychology. So if you know anything about evolutionary psychology or evolutionary science, you may know that a lot of us in the field view evolution as sort of an approach as opposed to just a content area, right? So you could have developmental psychology or clinical psychology or whatever, cognitive psychology. You can study any of those content areas from an evolutionary approach, right? So you can take the approach and then study the area that you're interested in. And I happen to be interested in clinical psychology. So when I found out that there was this thing called evolutionary psychology where you could learn about whatever you're interested in, but take an additional perspective that could help out understand the concepts in the field, I thought, well, this is what I want to do. So it's sort of a new thing in some regards, this sort of the formalized field where you look at clinical psychology and you take evolutionary perspectives. So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. Maybe some of you are interested in evolution but not clinical psych. Maybe some of you it's the other way around and you're interested in clinical psych but don't really know how to maybe apply evolutionary perspectives to that. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. And the first thing that I want to show you is that because the field is so new, basically in the last couple decades, maybe from the late 80s, maybe even more recently, has there really been an organized look at clinical psychology from an evolutionary perspective? Nobody knows what to call that field. So what you're looking at up there is when I was trying to find programs that have an interest in this thing, right? Whatever we call it, or trying to find research in this area, I had to look up 1,000 different synonyms for the name of the field. It was just so hard to find any given body of literature that all used the same term. So do we call it evolutionary clinical psychology, clinical evolutionary psychology, evolutionary psychopathology, Darwinian psychiatry? So everything you could think of, okay? So that was the first thing. That's why I put this up here, so you'll know that it's all really the same thing. I think about it in a very broad sense. There's the field of clinical psychology or counseling psychology even, and we're looking at how can evolution address those fields. Okay, so that's what this is. Now, to talk about this, I want to talk about a little bit about the history of evolution and clinical, that juncture right there. So the history of it really goes back to Darwin in the sense that, as you may know, heard of this guy Charles Darwin. He was the one who really made evolution famous when he formalized the theory of natural selection, the mechanism behind most of evolutionary outcomes, right? Or a lot of the functional evolutionary outcomes. And the thing about Darwin was that he was interested in a whole lot of things, and one of them happened to be mental illness, right? He happened to visit some of the asylums of his time, and he had a lot of interesting thoughts about what he saw there, people with mental illness. And he wrote about that in some letters to some of his colleagues. But really, the thing that he most contributed to the current study of clinical psychology from evolutionary points of view was his work on the emotions. So if all the successes in psychology of this evolutionary approach, one of the most complete, I think, has been on emotions. Because in a lot of the things that we talk about here in evolutionary psychology in your class, social psychology, people, sexuality, people fighting, people mating, a lot of these things, they're pretty controversial. They can be controversial in the field of psychology as a whole, right? Some people say, well, that's not due to an evolutionary basis, right? They argue about it. The thing about emotions is that most people, even those who are not really evolutionary thinkers, implicitly, when they write about emotions in the field of psychology, admit that emotions are probably functionally evolved adaptations of our human species, right? So, and this came from Darwin. Darwin said, well, we all seem to make these faces when we're upset, and it seems to be the same face. Everyone makes similar faces when they're upset versus when they're happy versus when they're surprised or disgusted. And so the first science book that had photographs in it was his book on the emotions of man and animals. Okay, so this is not a photograph, obviously, but it's a drawing of a photograph that was in the book. So he used photographs to show the different facial features, and what he was doing was he was saying, well, he had just come up recently, I don't know, a few years before, he had published a book on natural selection, his big magnum opus, and then he published stuff about here's natural selection in relation to humans. And then he said, well, let's look at emotions in human and animals, and maybe we could draw some parallels between these sort of the wings of the bat and the bird and the fins of the fish on one hand, and emotions on the other. Do emotions have a functional purpose? And he was saying, yes, I think they do, because you can see other animals, they seem to have what look like emotions. You see dogs get, angry, right? They put their tail between their legs when they're scared. The tail can go straight up when they're aggressive, and wag when they're happy. We know what dogs do with their tails. Okay, so Darwin pointed all this out and said this is very analogous to human facial expressions. And so if this has a function in other animals, then we should think about it having a function in humans. And what happened is that sort of fell out of vogue in the middle of the 20th century when a lot of anthropologists and maybe some behaviorists were trying to argue that there really were no universal emotions or facial features. And then with the work of Paul Ekman and others, it turned out that, yes, universally people make pretty much the same facial expressions for the emotions. And so when emotions like happiness or anger, the primary emotions, are discussed in the psychology literature, they're thought of in functional terms, right? That natural selection has created these emotions because they're a positive feedback system. If you're doing something that is good, you're happy and you do more of it. If you're doing something that is, or if something gets done to you that's not good, you can get angry in order to avenge yourself and so forth. So this has been a very powerful line of research that is still around today. When we talk about clinical psychology, a lot of the things that we deal with are emotions, so it really goes back to Darwin. So you may have heard of Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, who were both in basically the psychiatry field, right? And psychiatry is just, if you have a medical school background, an MD, you're a psychiatrist. If you go to a PhD program, you would be a psychologist, but a lot of the fields have overlapped these days. So that's not a really important distinction if you see those two words in this presentation. They both had Darwinian ideas in mind, although to a large extent, the work of Freud especially is not really widely used in evolutionary perspectives. Although if you've taken any clinical courses, you know that certain elements of Freud's work, like the unconscious and defense mechanisms, have been kept around. Okay, but the point is that these two guys were inspired by Darwin, if not in the same way that we think about the formal field of evolutionary clinical psychology today. So here's what we have. We have this throughout then the 20th century, we had a sort of a reintroduction of these evolutionary hypotheses into the clinical literature. So there was this field that at the time was called ethological psychiatry, and we don't use the term anymore. But here's what this was. Ethology is the study of natural animal behavior. So ethological psychiatry was, well, we should look at other animals, right, other species, non-human animals, and then we should acknowledge that they're related to each other through common descent, through evolution. So if we see things that look like mental illnesses in other animals, then we could say, well, if they look like human mental illnesses, and we know what's happening in this animal, then we can make a comparison, and we can see what's happening in terms of neurotransmitters or brain regions or behaviors and that sort of thing. So that was what that ethological psychiatry, that term is really describing that type of research. And we're talking about that happened in the 1960s. So this was really sort of the resurgence of this idea of evolution and clinical psychology really being complementary or being used together, right? So, for example, animal models of anxiety disorders, if you cage an animal depending on what type of animal it is, like let's say you put a tiger in a pen that's smaller than a tiger wants to be, and you could agitate the animal, and he'll do the pacing thing where if you see in a zoo and you think, oh, this is such a cruel zoo, because you see the animal pacing around and you know that he's not happy, right? Just walking in circles, right? Or doing other types of behaviors that are repetitive, that may be functional in other circumstances but are not functional at that moment. For example, pigeons pecking repeatedly at nothing, right? Like they're feeding, but there's nothing there. they call those stereotypies. It has nothing to do with like stereotypes, like we think of it in terms of social psychology or something. Stereotypies. The animal is doing a behavior because it's anxious. And so those models were like, well, okay, well, humans do that too, right? When we're anxious, we do things, you know, that are not really functional, or we have OCD-type behaviors where we repeat things. So that's what this ethological psychiatry thing was about. So, the field really became formalized using that term in the late 70s, although some of the ingredients were there in the 60s. So by the 70s, we had this book came out and used the term, and then it included perspectives from this field called sociobiology, which is really the forerunner of evolutionary psychology, right? So this looked at the evolution of social behavior, right? So evolutionary psychology really just expanded that to more things, and for a number of silly political, historical reasons, academic immaturity, this term was basically discarded like a used paper cup or something. It was sort of, they left it behind. People are only beginning to now take back this term. But it did include perspectives from that field, which is basically evolutionary psychology now. So what would an ethologically based psychiatry look like? If you're treating humans in the clinic and you want to use the observations from this animal research, what does that look like? Well, first of all, you observe, right? You don't just listen to what the person tells you. You realize that the things that the person is doing are just as important as what they're telling you. So you should look at that because when you observe animals, you see the observed behaviors, right? So there really is an emphasis on maybe not just the verbal aspects, but the nonverbal, right? There's emphasis on the natural function of behaviors, right? That's something that is explicitly evolutionary. If you say that somebody's doing something and there's no reason for it, and you should stop being so angry, then that's one way of looking at it. But if you look at anger as having a natural function of, let's say, changing somebody's mind. Somebody doesn't want to give you something and you feel cheated, and so you get angry and then you grab it from them. Then that's a functional physiological state that has created in you the urge to make things even, or whatever. There's a natural function of aggressive behavior in dogs, for example, right? So when they fight, they get aggressive, they get angry. If we're going to use an analog between a human emotion and an animal behavior, as Darwin did, the dog gets angry, right? And so you have to make that parallel to use this perspective in the field. And then you have to reject the idea that was very popular at the time, and to some extent, a lesser extent, is still present in some academic circles, of the idea of the mind as a blank slate, right? So if the mind is a blank slate, then you could pretty much, everything that you do has to be, learned from your culture, your surroundings, your environment, and so on. And you do learn things from there, but the blank slate perspective of the mind, this is the Latin for it, would say that you're not born with any inborn tendencies to do anything. And if you take a biological or evolutionary perspective, that is doesn't seem to be the case, right? It seems to be that we have propensities to do certain things, right? If we're hungry, we eat, and nobody really has to teach us to, drink milk when we're an infant, for example. We just do it. Okay, these are not, and everything that we do, we don't have to be taught anger necessarily. It's something that we have in us. And so the ethologically based psychotherapy that uses evolution, right? Even if we call it evolutionary psychotherapy instead of ethologically, doesn't matter. It's just a terminology thing. It's not a big difference. You have to be able to admit that there are some things that the human nature might have that it could be born with. And so related to that is behavior has a lot of different causes. Multidimensionality is the scientific word for it. But the reason that you act in a certain way is not just because of your culture, your environment where you grew up in, right? It's because there's things going on with your body physiologically, with your genes, with your environment, your physical environment and your social environment, your biology, all of these things, right? So a lot of therapy at the time, and even now today, looks at what you've learned, what your home situation is, maybe what your relationship with your parents is, depending on what type of therapy you're in. But this type of evolutionary-based psychotherapy would really look also at some of these biological factors that make us human, and say, well, we have tendencies. We have particular tendencies to do particular things, and so we should take those into account when we're treating somebody in a clinical psychology setting. All right. So then this term evolutionary psychology really became a thing. It became a popular thing in the mid-'80s. when the formal field of evolutionary psychology was established. And so these are three of the books starting in the 80s and then moving into the 90s that were sort of foundational to that. Some particular schools of thought were associated with evolutionary psychology. For example, the people at UC Santa Barbara, whose names are Lita Cosmides and John Tooby, they're a married couple, they're considered, pioneers of evolutionary psychology, the formal field, as are Daly and Wilson, as are David Buss. And so that was considered evolutionary psychology for the time. But nowadays, it seems like a lot of people in the field really want to widen that definition to mean any sort of psychology that takes evolution into account, whether or not you think about it in the same way as Cosmides and Tooby and David Buss. If you're thinking about evolution while you're doing your psychology, you're doing evolutionary psychology. That's the movement in the field. That's where I think it's going. So, but I wanted to tell you that the actual term really came about in the mid to late 80s and really formalized the field. Okay, so once that formal evolutionary psychology program was created, then there were a few more attempts to integrate these fields of evolution and clinical stuff. So, for example, the use of adaptationism, the idea that we have particular behaviors that might have helped us in our past, when we were, hunter-gatherers on the savannah, or even before that when we were apes or when we were fish even, right? We have these behaviors that help us to do certain things, and maybe they're supposed to be there, right? Evolution put them there, and maybe they're not good all the time, but there's a natural function thing going on there. And so that would be like, so some people at the time would say maybe sadness, right? As we talked about the emotions, maybe sadness or even prolonged depression may have a functional purpose, right? We may do something like be uncontrollably sad after somebody passes away because that's functional. That helps us do something, right? And we won't talk about exactly what that is at this moment, but that was what evolution really added to clinical psychology in the late 80s, early 90s. Also, the idea of there being a mismatch between our current environment and the one in which we evolved in. So this is a controversial idea in some regards, but the idea that our current environment that humans live in is not really our natural environment in which we spent the last, hundreds of thousands of years before agriculture. And then before we were even human, we had a completely different environment, which was also very dangerous and uncertain. So we might have behaviors that made sense then and don't make sense now, just because we're in a mismatch. Just if you took a penguin and you put it in the Serengeti, right? The penguin is not going to be comfortable. Okay, it's the same idea. It's we're evolved to perhaps be able to metabolize certain small amounts of poppy. That is the plant, right? However, if we purify it to get an unnatural substance and then we inject it right into our veins, well, that's a mismatch because our body was not meant to handle that purified heroin, and so it can kill us. So this is sort of mismatch theory being applied. So this is one of the ways we could apply evolution, again, to clinical psych. Now, when I think about the field of evolution and clinical psychology, when I think about that juncture, I'm interested in a lot of questions, but they really all seem to fall under this big question here, which may be broader than the way some people think about it, and that is, how should the fact that the brain, and therefore our minds, evolved, how does that fact inform the way that we should understand or classify and treat mental disorders or mental issues, not even just disorders, but other clinical issues like couples counseling, right? This is not a disorder. A lot of times couples fight not because one of them has a disorder, but because they're two normal people with disagreements. How can the evolution of the mind inform that? That could also be considered part of this rubric. So it's a very, very broad question, right? It's not just saying that every mental disorder has an adaptive function. We're not saying that. That's not logically really feasible. Although there is some of that in the field of maybe mental disorders, maybe some of them do have functions, right? We're not saying that everything does. All we say when we integrate these two fields is, how does the evolution of our brain, how can it inform the way we do clinical psychology? That's the thing, okay? So it is the case that we're vulnerable to a lot of mental disorders, okay? So not everything that's considered a mental disorder in the manual of mental disorders is necessarily a disorder, right? Because some people wrote this, people can be wrong, right? And if you know anything about clinical psychology, you'll know that there is a lot of controversy about the newest DSM, which is the manual that's about to come out next month, I think, that describes, it's going to be for the next, 8-10 years, the model of psychology about what disorders we diagnose in people. And people don't like it, so it's not always right when we say that the thing in the manual that says a disorder, that's an actual dysfunction, that's a disorder when you're disordered. It may not be the case, but it is the case that we are vulnerable to some disorders. And some of them have genetic bases. Some of them don't, right? Some of them, some disorders seem to not really have a genetic basis. Some disorders seem really weird and culturally specific. I don't know if anyone has heard of Koro. That is in Asia. That is a mental disorder. You don't seem to see it around here. People are afraid that their penises are shrinking and will disappear. Okay? So it's, and not just an individual, but a lot of people get this mass delusion that this is happening, and they get very frightened of it. And so we say there's a culture-bound disorder, they have Koro. And there's a lot of weird culture-bound disorders where some cultures get them, other cultures don't. We don't know exactly why they're getting them, but it's hard to look, it's a little more challenging to look at those from an evolutionary perspective. But there are a lot of disorders where we know that there is some genetic basis for it, and for whatever reason, we have a vulnerability to it. Because we have a vulnerability to the disorder, that is an evolutionary paradox, right, if there's a genetic basis for it. Cross-culturally, universally, all humans seem to be able to have a vulnerability to these disorders. It requires an answer. So this question is not the only question which we could ask. The question at the top, why do we have mental disorders? That's one of the questions that we could ask from this big, broad question that I put up here. But the one that I'm very interested in, one of the ones that I'm interested in, is this question. Why do we have mental disorders? Because they exist, and some of them have some evolutionary background, history, right? They've been there. Our brains are evolved, therefore if we have a vulnerability to a disorder, that vulnerability evolved. Why did it evolve? There's a lot of reasons why a disorder could have evolved, and that's one of the things that we look at. So really, it's an interesting question if you're into this stuff, because we're not asking, why does my friend Joe have bipolar disorder? Okay, that's an interesting question. It's certainly of relevance to Joe, but from a more interesting question to me, who is studying disorder on the whole, is why do we have bipolar disorder at all? Why not why Joe has it and why I don't have it? Why do we have that at all? Okay, and so there are a lot of answers, purported hypotheses in this field that try to answer this question. And so some disorders may be treated like adaptations. In other words, some scientists might say, the reason we have a particular disorder, one disorder or another, is because it's an adaptation, because natural selection created us to work in that way. Now that's problematic for a lot of disorders, right? Because most things when we think about disorders or mental illnesses, these things don't increase our fitness, right? Our reproductive fitness. Most of the time, when we have a mental illness, we're not having more children who then go on to have more children and pass on our genes, right? And therefore, that wouldn't have happened in a natural environment, 500,000 years ago, 1 million years ago. So that's problematic to say that a disorder can be an adaptation, although in some cases it may be. Right? It's a possibility that we have to look at for particular disorders. So maybe a disorder is an adaptation. Maybe it's an adaptation that is supposed to work one way, but it's dysregulated. It's overexpressed. I'll give you some examples because I know it's hard to think about what we're talking about. So some people might say that obsessive compulsive disorder is an adaptation. You know what obsessive compulsive disorder is, because you've heard it so often in popular media, but just so we have an idea, there's a lot of different symptoms that seem to occur in OCD, different types of symptoms, and one of which is where you're obsessively clean and you want, in terms of germs, of pathogens, you want to make sure everything is washed and clean and has no germs, to the point where it's actually bad for you, right? You're actually making your hands bloody, you're washing them so much, you're cleaning everything, you're very afraid of getting contaminated. Another type of symptom, which you may or may not have if you have the cleaning one, is when you hoard a lot of stuff that you don't need. Another type of symptom is when you organize stuff just so, or you have rituals where you repeat things, you count things. You do a lot of different things. You want all these papers to be straight, for example, or you're afraid something bad's going to happen. Another type of symptom yet is you might be afraid something bad's going to happen, and you keep checking on things to make sure you didn't leave the oven on, to make sure you didn't run over a guy a mile back there, to make sure that you lock the door. So there's a lot of these different things. People have thought maybe they're adaptations, right? Other people have thought, well, that doesn't make sense, because if you're doing all these things, you're not out there having children, are you? You're having a lot of distress, and your mind is not going to be on sex if you're in the throes of a mental disorder. So maybe those behaviors are adaptations, but in OCD they're dysregulated, they're overexpressed. You can't stop worrying. Maybe worrying is okay, it's an adaptation, but you can't stop worrying. That's a dysregulation of that. So these are two sort of complementary but different approaches to mental disorder, right? If we want to think about what a disorder is. Maybe it's not an adaptation at all. It's maintained through some other evolutionary forces. And you maybe have to know a lot about evolutionary biology to appreciate all the different evolutionary forces that are out there. And there's just some terms here that I'll throw at you and maybe explain. But sometimes some features of your mind or of your body are byproducts. They don't do anything in and of themselves. They're not for anything. They're just there, okay, because you need them for something else. So you have an earlobe, and it's great that you have an earlobe, right? And some of you put things through them, and so you could decorate them. But they're not for anything, really. They're there because you have an outer ear, and your outer ear has to end somewhere. And the outer ear might be functional, but your earlobe itself is a byproduct, okay? So maybe the mind has things like that. Things that we can't really get rid of, right? They're just there because you've got other things. In other words, for example, we have an ability to speak, and we have a very complex mind, and some people have thought, because of that complex mind, because of our ability to speak, we're vulnerable to getting schizophrenia. That's sort of one of the more severe mental illnesses where there's a severe impairment of reality, of understanding reality and of conveying, expressing yourself. Maybe the reason we are vulnerable to schizophrenia is because our mind is so complex, it does so many things that it's just vulnerable to breaking in that particular way. So that would be sort of a byproduct explanation. A constraint explanation would be similar. There's some constraints. You can't have everything in any machine, including the brain. You can't do everything. Sometimes if you make if you're making a model airplane or something, if you make it bigger, then it's going to be heavier, right? And if you make it lighter, then you have to use different type of wood or whatever. You always have to make some design compromise when you're building something. The same thing happens with the brain. Maybe we have the best brain that we can possibly have, and there's going to be just some flaws that natural selection is not going to be able to get rid of. Okay, and mutation selection balance is a particular thing which I think I'll talk a little more about in a second. It's just as that natural selection maybe can't get rid of all these mutations that happen. Okay, so if I want to delve more into the adaptationist perspectives on mental illness, which I do, I want to tell you that some researchers do posit this. So they'll say, for a disorder, maybe we shouldn't think of it as a disorder at all. We should think of it as an adaptation, as I said. So just a couple of examples of these, because they normally come in two flavors, right? So I call them the strong and the weak adaptationist perspective. So it just helps me make sense of them. So the strong type of adaptationist claim would be that disorder is an adaptation, and it was evolved because it helped people in the past. This disorder, as it is right now, is an adaptation. And these are rare, and they kind of seem silly and easy to make fun of sometimes because you're saying that a disorder is an adaptation. And again, disorders make your fitness go down a lot of the time. So it may not make sense, but sometimes people do posit this. For example, there's somebody who believes that bipolar disorder, in which somebody will vacillate between being sort of manic and hyper and very, very excited about life and talking really fast and being grandiose and having these delusions and all that, to being maybe a few months later very, very depressed and very slow, very sad, can't get out of bed, suicidally depressed. So vacillating between these two extremes is very distressing for these people, right? They're in and out of mental institutions, mostly out because of the current state of the mental health system in this country, and they're at a high risk for suicide and other violent crimes. So it's very bad to be in this state, but this particular researcher who thought this was an adaptation thought, well, maybe the genes came from a cold climate in which, in the northern and southern latitudes of the world, as you probably know, there's long summers, or sort of not long summers, but long periods of daytime, right, that last half the year, and then long periods of darkness, which last half the year. So this person was saying maybe this sort of rhythmic thing we have in some people is an adaptation to that climate. Now, I don't particularly buy that explanation, but then again, I haven't read the paper and I don't want to be overly judgmental, but I'm just telling you that that's an example of a strong type of adaptationist claim. You're saying this disorder evolved for that reason. So people who are in that climate in the dark for 6 months, well, they need to be able to be a little bit hyper and a little bit on top of their game, whereas when it's sunny, I don't know what they say, it's never good to be depressed. I don't necessarily buy this explanation, but I want to show you what that looks like. Another one that makes a little more sense is a lot of people think that depression, at least the emotion of depression, maybe not major depressive disorder, which is extremely long and seems to have no cause, but depression may be an adaptive mechanism, like any other emotion, like anger, like surprise, like disgust, an adaptive mechanism to do different things. And a lot of people have different explanations of what depression is for. Some people will say, well, it's to get other people on your side in a social scenario where you're sad and withdrawn. Some people say it's in order to help you figure out problems, to solve problems better because you're now in a more ruminative thinking about things state. Okay, they say different things, but the idea is that that would be a claim of depression as an adaptation. Okay, and I call it the strong claim because the weak claim would be that the symptoms are maybe initially evolved as an adaptation, but they're getting dysregulated. So we're not saying that the disorder is an adaptation. We're saying that the disorder is sort of a dysregulation, maybe an overexpression of those behaviors. So OCD, like I mentioned, as a dysregulation would be sort of that type of claim. Or if you said bipolar disorder, even if it did evolve in the Antarctica or Greenland for that environment, you're not supposed to vacillate that wildly between extremes. So in those people, dysfunction has caused you to vacillate even more wildly, but you're not. But the disorder itself is still a dysfunction, not an adaptation. If you're saying that, then you're sort of making a weak adaptationist claim, right? You're saying that the thing that's happening maybe is underlied by systems that do this for a purpose, but they're just going haywire in this particular disorder. So that's the adaptationist claims. The question is, what do you do about that, right? So if you say that somebody comes into your clinic and has a mental disorder, if you personally think that disorder is an adaptation, what do you do with that information? Do you say, no, you're supposed to be working that way, so go home, you're fine, right? It's natural. Like, no, of course not. That's not what most clinical psychologists would say. That's a barmy notion, right? You have to, clinical psychologists, many of them, the good ones, right? Their primary focus should be to alleviate the suffering of individuals or those around them. So even if you did have really good evidence that some mental disorder was an adaptation, you really have to consider the context and the function of what the disorder would be trying to do, and then take the context of the individual's situation into account. And you would probably still somehow have to treat those symptoms regardless of whether or not you felt it was an adaptation. And I keep qualifying this because I'm not sure if there's really great evidence for any particular disorder to say that it's an adaptation, although I could show you a few that seem to be the best candidates a little later on when I give you specifics. So that's what you would do if you thought that something was an adaptation. You would still probably have to treat it. All right, let's go. Moving on. But then, just because you have some trait doesn't mean that natural selection created it for a purpose. It doesn't mean it's an adaptation, right? You've got an earlobe, for example, right? You've got you've got a little thing right here between your nose and your lip, and it's called a philtrum, and it's like a little groove right above the middle of your upper lip, and that's not for anything. It happens to be there because when your face is developing as a fetus, it's got to like stitch together somewhere, and that's the seam. Okay, these are other evolutionary outcomes besides adaptation, right? Or genetic drift. We know genetic drift, right? Sometimes traits just happen. Natural selection doesn't act on them. They're not really they're not really hurting you. They're just sort of there, and so genetic drift means that you sort of randomly evolve in some particular direction. So that can happen. But there's this really big paradox of all this, which I sort of alluded to before. There's some mental disorders which are common, okay? And they're harmful. That is, they hurt your reproductive success. They hurt you. You suffer from them. And they're heritable, in this case meaning that there's some genetic basis for the disorder, right? The difference between people who get the disorder and people who don't get the disorder has something to do with the genetics. And so we would say they're heritable. And they're mental disorders that cause harm, but they're being passed on through the ages, right? We're vulnerable to these mental disorders, even though they might reduce our fitness. So the big question is how that could possibly happen. Why haven't those genes been selected out of the gene pool entirely, okay? And one of the answers would be what we call balancing selection, right? That is, and I hate to get too much into the deep evolutionary terms here, so bear with me while I mention that balancing selection is just that it might be good for one thing but bad for something else. For example, if you're a very aggressive person, right? There are a lot of bad outcomes of that. You get hurt really easily, right? If you're always picking fights. However, you do get your way a lot of the time, right? And it might be even attractive to some people, right? Some people like the bad person, right? The bad boy or the bad girl, whatever. So some genes work like that. They make you, they increase your fitness in one regard, but they decrease it in another, and that's balancing selection. And adaptation. Adaptationist explanations can be one of those things. So if you know any of these terms, feel free to associate them in your mind, but I'm not going to explain each of them, except for the fact that in each of these cases, genes that do something good in particular individuals or in particular situations sometimes do bad things at other times of their life or in other individuals or in other environments and so forth. And one of the biggest ones that we want to talk about is the mismatch one. And there's a fancy term for it that they use, spatiotemporal variation in selection pressures, or you could say mismatch, right? And that is the selection pressure that created your genome right now is now different, right? So we evolved in the savannah, for example. Now now we moved to Northern Europe, and there's not getting enough sunlight, right? Because there's less sun up there. So our skin color over many generations changes. Okay, so we have a mismatch because if we now go back, if I go back to my ancestral homeland of Africa, which was all our ancestral homelands, right? And I stand out in the sun on the savannah, I'm going to burn like something in the microwave, right? I'm going to get burned to a crisp. This is a spatiotemporal variation in selection pressures, or it's a mismatch between my Eastern European ancestry, which created my skin tone, and the new environment that I'm trying to go put myself in, right? So we could say the same thing happens for mental issues, not even just disorders, but sexual jealousy, for example. If you're jealous of your partner having sex with somebody else, that's not a bad thing, right? I mean, in a natural environment where you're all living in a big kin group and your partner's trying to have sex with somebody, if you're able to put your foot down, then you're going to pass your genes on better than if you would let it happen, right? Someone else, the guy next door, is passing his genes down, right? However, if you, in this modern society, it still is the case that can be a helpful thing sometimes, but that can also be a very, very obnoxious way to express yourself, that jealousy, right? For a number of reasons in today's society, it might not be a great thing to be aggressively jealous of your partner, and so one of the things that's going on there is can be a mismatch between our sort of. Don't think of ancestral humans even. Think of when we all looked like reptiles or something. If we caught our partner trying to cheat, we could go over there, grab him by the neck, and pull him back, and then fight off the other the homewrecker, right? And that was good. And there wasn't really any downside to that because we didn't really have any social emotions that said, God, I feel really bad that he just killed my lover. We don't have these things going on back then. So now we do, and this is a bad thing. We've got a system with we've got a legal system, we've got laws, and if we did that kind of thing today, it would not be a good thing. So we have a mismatch, again, between our evolved emotions and our current environment, okay? But there's this other explanation for, and let me go back to what we're talking about again. Why do we have disorders that are harmful? They hurt you, but they're common, and they're genetically based. There's some genetic basis, right? There's some genetic basis for this disorder. How could that possibly not have been evolved out by natural selection? And this is a very sort of academic type of explanation. And it is this. Sometimes we have mutations, right? We haven't mentioned that too much, but you do have mutations, and some mental disorders are probably caused by mutations, right? So there's some mutation in your genes that make your brain and therefore your mind pathways develop in a different way, and you go do things that are bizarre or disordered, right? Now, most of the time, natural selection will get rid of those things. But what if the mutations that cause mental disorders are really, really small? You need a lot of them, and they have to be really, really small. So you need a lot of them to get a mental disorder, right? Because they're so small that in other cases, natural selection wouldn't see them, right? You would have many, 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 many tiny, tiny mutations, and if you had all those right mutations, those wrong mutations, in the wrong situation, then you could be vulnerable to schizophrenia, for example, or bipolar disorder. If that were the case, then mutations would actually build up faster than natural selection could get rid of them, right? If you think about if you're, I don't know, trying to kill ants that are coming into your kitchen, right? And then a ton of them break through the wall, right? You can't get rid of them fast enough. That's what could happen, theoretically, right? The mutations could go unnoticed until, in particular individuals, they cause mental disorder. So all of us have a mutation load. We all have some new mutations that we got that when we were developing, our genes got mutated from our parents' genes, but we also have the mutations that our parents gave us that they accrued over the generations. So we have all these little minor mutations, and maybe it does seem to be the case that in things like schizophrenia, you don't have one gene for schizophrenia. If there was only one gene for schizophrenia, then that would probably have been weeded out long ago. That's not a good gene to have. But maybe it looks like there's a whole lot of genes. And if there's a whole lot of genes that are involved, and if you only have a couple of mutations, then nothing's going to happen to you. But if you have all of them, then you'll get schizophrenia. So that's sort of what mutation selection balance is saying that sometimes you get mutations and natural selection just can't get rid of them fast enough, and that's why we have them. And so in particular combinations, they'll cause mental disorder. So, for example, schizophrenia might be one of the ones that this could apply to, or bipolar, or maybe obsessive compulsive disorder. And if you believe in this, right, this is a well-established thing that could theoretically happen, right? If you buy this, then you could still say that some other disorders might still be adaptations. You don't have to just pick one explanation for all disorders, right? What is the implication of that? If I told you that mental disorder is inevitable, right? Everyone's just going to have mutations, and it's going to happen. What does that say about the field? It's going to say that mental illnesses might just be inevitable, right? It's going to be very complex. Is it too hard to treat? Well, science marches on. Maybe everyone just has to think of illness in a different way. We say, okay, we all have a disease, we all have disorder, right? What's your disorders? My disorders are this. And this might be helped along by genomics. That might be a possible way of thinking about what the implications of mutation and selection balance on clinical psychology. It's hard to say, right? Does it mean that we're all going to have to take more drugs because we can never get rid of mental disorders? We really don't know what the implications are, but it is an interesting way to think about evolution and mental illness. Now, think about this. You're not saying that the mental illness is good for you and therefore it's an adaptation if you're talking about MS balance. You're saying that they just happen. It's still an evolutionary explanation. It's just not an adaptationist explanation, right? And then, a lot of times, research approaches that don't really fall into any of these other categories, but still take evolution into account, can be part of this whole big field that I'm interested in. So, as I said, the domains of impairment that happen in OCD, like the hoarding of resources and the cleanliness thing, you could think of them as individually evolved pathways that do healthy things that are good for us, right? Being careful of germs is a good thing, right? And keeping yourself safe is a good thing. So you could think about those types of things as being adaptations. You could think of mental disorders in relation to what Glenn's construct is of mating intelligence. This idea that if you have mental disorders, you might have an impaired mating intelligence, or if you're attracted to people with mental disorders, you might have impaired mating intelligence. So there's sort of a juncture there. We're not really talking in the same way that we were earlier about adaptations. It's just we're using the general field of evolution to illuminate some of these perspectives. And then this field of developmental psychopathology, where you take an individual's individual history, right, over their lifetime, and you also think about evolution. So you get evolutionary developmental psychopathology. Now you've put all these things together, and you have a really well-integrated field of understanding one's genetic history as well as their personal history. A couple things. I wanted to, first of all, there's some clinicians who do use evolutionary theory explicitly in their practice. For example, either counseling or clinical psychologists, especially if they're using cognitive behavioral therapy. If you know anything about clinical practice, some people have the therapy where you talk about your beliefs or your actions and try to change them, or family systems type therapies. And this is people who are clinicians who believe in evolution and like this may either explicitly tell their patients about this thing about evolution, or they might not. They might just think about it when they describe the therapies to their patients, because some patients don't want to hear about evolution, right? Others might. So, for example, if somebody's having problems at work with the boss and with the coworkers and not really understanding the boundaries at work, then the clinician might talk to them about status hierarchies, how humans have evolved the system of status hierarchy. We seem to be most comfortable in that situation on some level, knowing where we stand in a status hierarchy. For a couple that has relationship problems, maybe the male doesn't find the female sexy anymore, right? And so they come into the clinician's office. The clinician might say, well, according to evolutionary theory, this is normal for a couple who's been together for a while due to these particular processes that biologists believe males to go through. And so therefore, it's normal. And so you shouldn't feel bad about it. In fact, there are ways that you could re-arouse the feelings that you once had for each other. But don't feel like it means that you're not in love with her anymore, because this is a natural part of human mating. And so forth. So reciprocity, so if somebody has problems with other people and doesn't seem to understand reciprocity that well, there's a whole evolutionary theory of reciprocal altruism that you could explain. So you could use this really on an individual level in just counseling psychology, of using these perspectives that you learn in evolutionary psychology to help out with particular situations that people come into the clinic with. Okay? But you could also talk about specific disorders and the different ways that specific disorders can be illuminated by these perspectives. So in the last about 5 minutes, I'll just go through a couple disorders and talk about some of the perspectives that we could take on them from an evolutionary point of view. So from depression, I sort of mentioned this before, you might think of an adaptationist view of depression. If you think about depression as being analogous to human pain, right? So you're doing something that's bad for you, right? If I do this, that friggin' hurt, right? And my body's going to tell me so, that I should stop, and I got to stop, okay? Because if I keep doing that, I'm going to injure myself. And that was a feedback mechanism that my body needs to have, and if I did not have the ability to register pain, I would die young. Almost everybody who cannot feel pain dies young, because they have to get legs amputated if they lie on their leg too long, and they lose circulation to the leg, and they can't feel it, and they break bones and so forth and don't know it. So physical pain is important. Perhaps psychological pain like depression is important too, right? And so therefore, depressive disorder, when you actually have this disorder where there's no obvious reason why you're depressed, Maybe it's just a normal emotion, but it's become dysregulated for whatever reason. Chemical imbalance, like the psychiatrists like to say, maybe there is actual chemical imbalance or a brain injury or lesion. Maybe it's not that at all. Maybe it's your environment that's caused you to be have dysregulated emotions. There could be, as I mentioned, possible adaptive benefits that they're trying to figure out. Maybe you think better. That one is very controversial. Maybe it's a mismatch, right? Maybe our modern environment is just, we're more likely to get depressed because we can socially compare more often, more readily than we could in our ancestral environment. We could look at millions of people on the television or in a magazine that have better bodies than us, and we get upset. And so another perspective on depression is that maybe there's different ones, right? If you think about this functionally, well, maybe if you lose a baby, right, and you're depressed, then that makes sense. And so there have been some suggestions that if you don't breastfeed your baby, you're at a higher risk for postpartum depression because you might be sending an unconscious signal to your body that your baby has died. And so even unconsciously, you see the baby, your body's not getting a normal feedback that your baby is all right, which is the suckling that the baby would normally do. So it seems like this is a theoretically rich area. You could empirically test this out, whether or not you find the expected findings that postpartum depression is higher in women who do not breastfeed. And then of course, if you're grieving for a loved one, then there's going to be a depression that's going to be associated with that, and the new DSM is trying to put in grieving as a disorder, which a lot of people are very unhappy about. And there might be what we call idiopathic, where we just don't know what's going on. But this is a sort of functional. The idea that there's functionally different depressions is sort of needs to come from an evolutionary perspective. It doesn't have to, but it is very well informed by evolutionary perspectives. Anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, is often viewed as sort of the weak. If you remember, the weak adaptationist claim that that it's a good thing to have a little bit of it, but it's overexpressed. If you can't control your anxiety, then it's bad. Whereas if you have a little bit of it, then you know how to avoid unpleasant situations, and you can get out of dangerous situations, right? Phobias are one that actually does look like it's adaptive. So, we fear stimuli that are present in our natural environment, like the one which we involve, not dangerous stimuli that are present now necessarily. For example, okay, so if you saw this on the wall at your friend's house, would you be terrified? Okay, if you saw this, okay, you might be a little scared. What if you saw that? Okay, so that reaction right there. So there is it seems to be we're biologically more likely to fear certain types of stimuli, the ones that were dangerous to our ancestors, like certain dangerous animals, snakes, spiders, heights, right? High places, maybe the dark, dogs. And you don't usually find gun phobias or car phobias. Electricity phobias, things that could actually kill you, right? Phobias of heart disease, right? You don't find these things, even though these are the things that kill you, right? So, but it looks like you probably have another adaptation besides just biologically being prepared to be scared of these things, to make new phobias, right? So a lot of people are afraid of clowns, or they have some weird, bizarre phobia of some random thing that happened, because of some experience they had. So we may have this ability to create new phobias through conditioning. But this is sort of one of the best ways of looking at phobias is an adaptationist or an evolutionary response. If you're afraid of blood or guts, or when you get needle injections or shots, and you have ever experienced that fear, it's different than every other type of phobic fear. Instead of getting scared, nervous, anxious, heartbeat up, you get the other reaction. You start to faint. Your blood pressure goes down, and you feel faint, and your pulse slows. And one of the most interesting explanations, the best fit for this data, is that sort of the best theory is that if you saw blood in a natural environment, a lot of blood, there's a good chance that it's your own. And if you were to get very, very anxious and try to run away from that, you've done yourself a great disservice. Now you've got more blood that you're losing, right? So the adaptive response would be to slow things down, right? And it may be, this is it's not everybody in the world agrees on this, but it is a fairly good explanation for this difference that one phobia has from every other phobia. Antisocial personality, there's a question about whether or not it's a true dysfunction in a system, right? We have a morality system, and these people, it's broken because they don't have right and wrong, sense of right and wrong? Or is it an adaptive strategy that, that some people can have, and some people just, if only a few people take advantage of others, they're going to do really well. But if everybody tried to be cheaters and kill each other, then that's not really stable. So maybe it's an adaptive strategy that it's what we call frequency dependent. So I went to a conference where there were both of these sides arguing. Schizophrenia really seems like a real disorder, but is it a byproduct of our mental complexity, like I said earlier, like a byproduct of our language? There's some possibility that it actually is we haven't had schizophrenia the entire human history. It may have been only a few thousand years ago we started to get schizophrenia. Some people argue this. And it may actually be more akin to a medical condition, like an infection, like a parasite. In fact, there are Toxoplasma gondii, which is a little parasite thing that can give you that can infect you, actually makes you more likely to get schizophrenia. So it may be actually more of an infection type of model, or a mutation selection balance might explain this pretty well. Obsessive compulsive disorder, I've already covered the dysregulation, sort of weak adaptive perspectives. Maybe getting some sort of brain trauma or getting an infection when you're young can cause some OCD symptoms, so there's that perspective. And of course, again, mutation selection balance. Drug abuse, as I said before, okay, we accidentally can respond to some of the drugs, some of the chemicals that are in plants, so there's a mismatch there, right? It just so happens that our brain receptors are compatible with these certain plant toxins. But also it could be, some people have suggested that we have an adaptive ability to metabolize these compounds that would otherwise have been toxic, that would have killed us. Now we could just have fun with them or something. And then, as I told you, there's a mismatch where we could have purified drugs now, which are novel and dangerous. A new line of study that we may be able to self-medicate, that maybe smoking actually can kill parasites inside our bodies, little worms and stuff in developing nations or in hunter-gatherer societies, and people seem to smoke more when they're infected with these worms. So that's fascinating because that's unconscious. That is. When they cure the worms, then the people stop smoking. All right, it's not tobacco, but it's like tobacco, the thing that they used in this study. This is Ed Hagen's research. This was fascinating. So this possibility that there actually might be a self-medication. I'm not saying you have to believe all of these things. I'm saying that these are the type of evolutionary perspectives that are out there. So that's all I have. So I want to thank you all for being here, and I will take. Thank you. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions they would like answered? Yes, please.
So how can you tell which mental disorder is adaptive or not adaptive?
Right. That is the question is, how can you tell which mental disorders are adaptive versus which ones are not? And that is sort of the million-dollar question in the field, because if it looks, there's a couple of ways to answer it. First of all, if it looks like if you have that disorder and you are not having high reproductive success. Having a disorder makes you less likely to have children, less likely to take care of your relatives. Then it looks like there's a lowered genetic fitness, and the disorder may not be adaptive. And that is, in fact, most disorders, right? So in the cases where it does look like it may be adaptive, there should be some theoretical reason why it's adaptive. And you were at my last talk, so the lines of evidence that Schmidt and Pilcher, these two researchers, have come up with, they say, well, if you think that something is an adaptation, then you should be able to show that there's some genetic evidence for it, and there should be some cross-cultural evidence, and there should be medical evidence, and there should be some theoretical reason why it should make sense to be an adaptation, and so forth, and there's 8 of them. And if you have all these things, then you may be able to tell whether something is an adaptation. I would say that most people are of the agreement that very few mental disorders are actual adaptations. It just doesn't fit the data. Although if you look at phobias, it might be. And if you think of a weak adaptationist perspective, if you think that a lot of these are disorder or maybe adaptationists or maybe processes, natural processes that are going awry, that might be a more productive way to think about disorders than simply saying that this disorder is an adaptation and that one's an adaptation and so forth. So yeah, it's a big debate, and the people who feel strongly for depression as adaptation are really adamant about that, and other people are very, very critical of that. Anyone else have anything? Yes, Mandy.
So I remember in health psychology we learned about the biopsychosocial view of approaching health. How does that relate to this? Is it kind of an evolutionary approach? Do people who support the biopsychosocial view also support this approach? Or?
Okay, yeah, so the biopsychosocial model of health or medicine or wellness is the idea that we need to take biology into account, like doctors do, but also somebody's psychological well-being and psychological state, as well as their social surroundings. So the question of how that fits into this, I think they're very compatible. I don't think that you have to go in for one or I think that you don't have to go in for both. If you believe in the biopsychosocial model, you could still be a creationist if you wanted to be, right? But people who think in that way, a multi-dimensional way, may be very appreciative of this. And similarly, people who think of evolution think about things in terms of a lot of different dimensions. Think about evolutionary history, genetic history, developmental history, psychological history. And so if you agree with evolutionary perspectives, you probably agree that a biopsychosocial perspective is the best way to treat disorder or something like that. Yeah, thank you. Yes, please.
Is it possible that we could look at any of these things as being attributes, let's say anxiety, and map it onto a bell curve where you've got some people who are way out there on the wings.
Yes.
And so, when we talk about caution, that's not maladaptive. But
Yes.
we're only looking when we pathologize it. You're just
Right.
talking about the folks who are down there on the wings.
Yes.
And so therefore, and it still they're still viable in terms of having children.
Yes. That's a terrific, I wanted to talk about that, but I didn't have time. But like just in case everyone, so everybody has some level of anxiety, right? Some people just don't get anxious at all, and this is your level of anxiety. Most people get, anxious. And then some people get really, really, really anxious, and there's not a lot of them. So most people get, moderately anxious. Some people are just here. And so the question of to what extent each of these different things that we talk about, let's say anxiety or or obsessive compulsive or sadness, depression, exactly, or washing your hands, or being neat. To what extent each of these can be conceptualized on a bell curve like this, where instead of either being disordered or not disordered, everybody is somewhere on a normal perspective, and if you happen to be high, then you say you have a disorder, and maybe if you happen to be low on certain things, then maybe you're a slob if you're really low on order and neatness. Most people are here, and then some people are obsessive compulsive. So yeah, this is a very, very pertinent debate to that, because the extent to which you conceptualize disorders as like this, as opposed to binary, either you have it or you don't, plays a lot into this perspective. And I would say that most disorders probably have something like this. I did OCD, that was my own research. Obsessive compulsive disorder, I was trying to find if there was this pattern. It seems like there kind of is, but there also seems to be a disconnect. Yeah, I mean, it's terrific. That's an extraordinarily important piece of this debate, which I just didn't have time for today. Yeah. Yes, Dr. Mann.
Isn't it also true that the correlation between having some set of these phenotypes and having a pathology is going to be very subjective, whether or not it affects somebody's activities in daily life, or whether it doesn't? That's a correlation.
Yes. So, does that go to the definition of disorder? Is that what you mean? Right. Right. Yeah. The one thing that I wanted to talk about but didn't really have time to fit into this is the definition of disorder. And now I could talk about it. There's a particular evolutionarily informed definition of what disorder is. Because in the field, there's no one definition. And so I kept using the term, but there's no real consensus about what that means. So Jerome Wakefield is a counseling psychologist who believes you should say, if you want to say something is a true disorder, it should meet two criteria. It should be harmful to the person or society. They should experience some suffering from it, subjectively. And it should be a dysfunction of some sort of adaptive evolutionary adaptation. It should be a dysfunction in that, so it's not working correctly. If it's both of those things, you could say a disorder. If it's not both of those things, he believes you wouldn't call it a disorder. So if you have a phobia of, I don't know, having your throat slit or something, it might cause you severe harm. But if if you're supposed to fear danger, right, he might say that's not a disorder. Throat slit wasn't a good example. If you're afraid of snakes, for example, right? If you have a pathological fear of snakes, but you're suffering from it, but it's not disordered because it's not a dysfunction. According to a lot of these theories, if you fear snakes, that's a normal function of the human body. Yeah, it's a terrific question because if you can't agree on what the disorder is, you can't agree on really anything else. It's a definition I like, but it's problematic, and it goes to what you were saying about the subjectivity of deciding what is a disorder and what is not. And it seems like an academic argument about the definition of disorder, but it's really not, because if you can't agree on what a disorder is, then it's really hard to agree on anything else beyond that. It's a very tricky subject, and I don't know so much about it, but it's very important.
Yeah, let's take one more question.
Okay.
And then encourage people to talk to you at the reception after.
Yes. So that's what I was going to do. I want you to come up to me at the reception if you have any unanswered questions and talk to me. Yes?
I did some studying on Ayurvedic medicines.
Okay. Okay.
And looking at how what can become imbalanced, and then that in some circumstances can create imbalances and bring on disease or mental disease or whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at yoga and meditation and like nutrition and different ways to treat certain disorders. I'm wondering, within your study and with your colleagues, do they take into account, I'm sure they do, but like the amount of time we spend looking at screens and the effect on our pineal gland, the lack of sleep we have, the quick pace, or just like the food we eat. I'm sure they do, but I'm curious, like, have you done any of that as well, like looking at these ancient technologies and spending time outside, and like how
Right.
it affects our ability to be balanced?
Right. Okay, there's a lot there. And yes, the short answer is yes. So the question is, there's a lot to it, but essentially, do you look at this concept of balance in some other traditions of medicine and so forth. You could frame that in a way that's scientifically sort of consonant with the literature here. And that is basically the concept of mismatch, of spatio-temporal variation, kind of. So if you're sitting all day on your bottom looking at a computer screen, as a lot of us do, that's our work, there's going to be, we're not in the same environment that we were in when most of the time when we were active, when we were outside, we were getting a certain amount of sunlight. And this is, there are real reasons why getting the right amount of sunlight is good. If you get too much, you could, first of all, get sunburn and cancer, but you could also have, I guess, low folic acid. If you get too little, then you don't get enough vitamin D. So you have to get a right amount of sunlight, right? And you have to get the right amount of exercise. And if you're, our bodies are pretty hardy, actually, considering what we do to them, right? The things that we eat. I had fast food 2 days in a row. I'm still alive. I can't believe it. But the things that we do to our bodies are not, are very different than what we do, what we evolved with, and that's an extremely important point. So this whole mismatch thing is behind a lot of the literature about, depression, for example. It may be the case that a lot of depression and other things are a result of our lifestyle that are not, you would say, in balance. We would say, or not, we can say the same thing if you want, or not a match to our ancestral environment. So yeah, it's a big part of it. All the things you mentioned may play a part, although it's not clear to what extent each little thing contributes to mental disorder, but it certainly does. So I want to thank you all again. I'm going to go over to the pizza room, and I want you all to talk to me if you have any questions, okay? Thanks.